Hey, Dom.
Hey, Jenna.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
That was a weird pause. Like, I really have to think
It's
about that.
good.
I
It's
guess. Well,
good.
it's weird because people often ask each other, like, how is it going? And then you kind of very in an instant have to choose in your mind, do I tell them the truth or do I just say what's socially expected? Oh, it's good. And then you just both keep it moving.
Well, because do people really want to hear the truth sometimes? I mean,
But there's been
I don't know.
studies about that apparently like people don't really that's just like a, innocuous question that Americans, I've been told, ask each other without real interest in the truth
I
behind
do that
the
all the
answer.
time. I do that all the time. I mean, I think it's just, you feel like you don't want people. It's like, oh, they're not going to want to know the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Yeah, well, let's talk about handling the truth. Let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award-winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid-off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. All right, so what is going on in the world today? That's kind of a vague question. There's
I
a lot
know.
going on. A lot, too much is going on.
I think this week, though, for our headlines, what's been really going on is the people are still talking about the debate that happened this week. The second debate, for the first of the second debate.
Okay, well, it's the first
I
debate
know.
between these two. It's the second
Yes,
debate
I
for
know.
former President Donald Trump. It's the first debate between former President Donald
Yes.
Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, but the second presidential debate because before,
It's
the timeline, Dom, I don't know, like, did someone like eat a magic cookie or do something in another dimension? Because this is so weird.
But there's been so much buildup for this debate and what it actually means
Yes.
to what's happening across this election, and then of course for us looking at it from the journalistic aspect is how much of it also was hyperbole of people just getting so riled up in terms of this debate, and when it finally happened, oh god.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that, like, people getting so riled up. At this point, politics is like a football team in this country. Like, you get all riled
really
up to, like, support your team. And, like,
Yep.
okay, it's game night live on
Yeah.
CNN. Like,
I
we're still
don't
picking
know.
the leader of the free world, right?
Jenna, I don't know, but what was definitely interesting from the debates were, I think, one of the biggest parts, of course, other than some of the things that were said during it, were the issue of fact checking. This was the ABC moderators, ABC News moderators, David Muir and Lindsay Davis. They were, there were a few times that they did fact check during this debate, and all of them towards Donald Trump. And there, of course, were some people who were very happy about that, and some who were not so happy about it. I know in the CNN debate that was held in June between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, there was no fact checking. There was no real time fact checking, I should say.
Correct.
This was This was real time fact checking, and it's interesting. I found something where it was a survey, a media and technology survey from Boston University's College of Communication from June 20th of 2024. Now, this is before the first debate between Trump and Biden. They did a survey and it said 69% of respondents said debate moderators should point out factual inaccuracies in candidates' comments during the debate. So it seems like many people in the public do want this. I think the thing I found so interesting is everybody wants it as long as it's not aimed at their candidate. People want the fact checking as long as it's not fact checking their own candidate. They are cool with it in terms of just, Do you know what I
Again,
mean?
that just to me that brings it back to like a sport. You're treating the fact checkers like they're refs,
Yeah.
and like the refs are being unfair. Like, okay, what we've learned is that a lot of, I would say, followers of Donald Trump, what they have said in their own words is that a lot of them take him, they don't take him literally when he says things. So they think it's fine when he engages, and I guess what they see is nothing more than harmless hyperbole or something in his stump speeches. You cannot do that in a debate. Like, you can't just say wild crap that you just like, you can't do that. And some of the stuff, I'm sorry, like, I mean, social media has taken off with the whole dogs and cat memes from Springfield, and which is interesting because there's been reporting where people have either already done reports from Springfield, I think it was Ohio, or have gone there and have talked to some of the business owners, and they're like, no, actually, the immigrant population is amazing. They show up on time, they do extra work, they don't complain, they did, which was different from what they had been dealing with. But it's such an extreme, and also I should say it's also race baiting, because one of the other things that I'm seeing online is that I guess two communities that didn't think they'd be locked together. I'm seeing videos from the Haitian and Korean community, both communities
Hmm.
that have been
Hmm.
accused of eating pets of white
Hmm.
people. Like, there's just
Yeah.
some stuff, yes, no, you can't just say that. So I do understand, but whether or not it was fair or not, I think maybe that depends more on who is saying the more egregious stuff. Who, I mean, can you detail every single
Right.
thing that was happening in real, because some people, most politicians, their inaccuracies are much more subtle. Like, it requires getting into the weeds and like really looking at the details and like, depending on what the meaning of the word is that kind of stuff.
I think it's a lot of for me the way I took it was trying to call out facts that were so egregious that they were
Yeah.
not, you know what I mean, like you had to say something or else it look, and I think that's what the impression I got. But so now I did look around. There was a divide in terms of how the media covered it depending on your outlet, and meaning like some of the more conservative outlets did not review this past debate that well. The National Review said fair debate moderators. This is a headline. Fair debate moderators would have fact checked Harris on these misleading claims, and they ended up listing claims that they said that, hey, it wasn't just Donald Trump who was, stating misfacts, but it was also Kamala Harris, and it's like, okay. I mean, that was their thing. They point out, but it kind of can get in the weeds sometimes, depending on like now you're talking about certain policy issues. But anyway, and
Well,
then
yeah,
but
that's
then
what I'm
you
saying, is that traditionally politicians, and it seems like what was more of her thing was she was more of a traditional politician,
yeah.
A, and B, she just kept teeing up bait for him to take, which he seemed to take every single time, and that was the debate.
Now Slate magazine, their Justin Peters wrote a piece and it said Tuesday night's debate was the best. Well, within his article, he wrote Tuesday night's debate was the best moderated presidential debate of the Trump era, because I think that's the thing too. People notice that ever since he's been in politics, he's been so divisive in terms of how journalists have handled him in these situations.
Of
I think,
course, I remember very early on during not his campaign, but definitely during his presidency, there was a whole debate within media as to what do we or do we not call something a lie.
mhm.
That was a huge debate. Passionate people on both
um,
sides.
and again, I forgot the author right now, but he is an editor for Variety, who wrote a book about Donald Trump being on The Apprentice. And I remember he had somewhere I heard an interview with him, and he mentioned how journalists don't really know how to handle Donald Trump in
Yeah.
debates. Like he isn't a traditional politician, unlike Kamala Harris, and there's different ways of handling him in terms of how you deal with interviews or so, it's that's just the truth. So, but anyway, that was one part of it. But the other part that I thought was interesting was Taylor Swift. Now, last week when we did our the power of
The
pop
endorsement
culture,
everyone was waiting for. one way or the other. Some people try to force the issue.
Exactly. I mean, but you remember last week we were talking in terms of the power of pop culture and news and politics.
Mm-hmm.
And here we have again the endorsement of Taylor Swift is huge. And it was announced right after. I remember they were on MSNBC, they were reading the endorsement. It was Rachel Maddow was reading it. And I was just like, wow, this is like, she had Tim Walz there, and she was like reading it to him, and it was like, that's how big this is, that people want to get the live reaction to this. I thought it was interesting that Taylor, in her piece, she wrote that recently I was made aware that AI of me falsely endorsing Donald Trump's presidential run was posted to his site. It really conjured up my fears around AI and the dangers of spreading misinformation. And I think that's a really important, again, that's an important thing for people to really understand too. This, eh, that's misinformation in this day and age, and how it's being used by whether it's whether it's a politician or whether it's a personality, and even how it's reported and dealt with in the news,
Yeah.
is really important because it can change. It can change a lot of things, a lot more than I think in this case. It could change an election. And also, I thought was interesting was the fact of, so now a sidebar, like I think Taylor also went off to tell people like, this is how she came up with vote. She endorsed Kamala Harris because she came up with this, but now she's, people have to make their own decisions. And as of 2 p.m. Wednesday, over 337,000 people from Taylor Swift's URL link to vote.gov visited.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
vote.gov.
that's happened before when she's made her endorsement, is that a lot of people will go and register. I'm assuming that we're talking about new, younger voters, perhaps. But then again, I'm not a
Who knows?
Swiftie, so I don't really get into the weeds on that demographic. Like, I accept she's not talking to me, and that's okay.
Well, I don't.
I'm not her demographic.
You know what though? I don't know. I think she's. I think there are even older people who haven't registered to vote, and I think that everybody. Sometimes you just need that individual to sort of help you see maybe what is important. You decide for yourself who you want to vote for, but at the same point, maybe it inspires somebody to be like, I need to care more. Maybe I didn't think about this enough, no matter what age. But you're right, mostly younger voters. But
I'm assuming, but again, I'm not a Swiftie. I hear about the power of the Swiftie world, but I'm not in the
we'll
Swiftie
see.
world, and I acknowledge. Well, yes. Well, with that, I think we should talk more about the importance of journalism, and let's go to our interview. The term real journalism is starting to show up more and more as social media has democratized who gets to share what with the world. Some see this development as a positive change, but others see it as a danger. To better understand the foundational principles of the journalism profession, Laid Off and Looking is starting our very first periodic called Back to Basics. And through it, we'll be discussing the nuts and bolts of journalism. And we're starting with one of the biggest points of contention: ethics. So Dom and I are turning to Carla Murphy. Carla's a professor of journalism at Rutgers University and a 15-year veteran covering issues of social justice and local communities. Carla, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you for joining us. So I'm just going to jump right in because there seems to be debate over right and wrong here. So what are journalism ethics?
So this is such good timing because this is back to school, at least for the Northeast. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The South started, a couple of weeks back. So literally I had my first class, which is a journalism ethics in the law class that I teach at Rutgers, Newark. That is all we talk about. So journalism ethics, there are, let me just say this, there are excuse me, traditional ethics, but then there are a range of them depending on who's producing that journalism and the time period in which they're producing that journalism. For me, I always start my class and I say that to them, that if they go into different newsrooms, they might encounter a different range of ethics. And then this is depending on if you're going into traditional kind of legacy news outlets, or if you're going into the nonprofit news outlets, or if you're going into public media, it changes. But I do tell them that there are about 3 or 4 core principles that are, excuse me, that thread throughout, that are in
Mm-hmm.
common. So one, of course, they've heard of objectivity. So I start with what they know, right? But that is a very controversial ethic, and we get into why that's controversial. In my class, I teach them objectivity of method to distinguish from objectivity, the colloquial uses of objectivity. But the main one that I stick on is verification, and that comes from, I'm not making up any of this, by the way. This is not my own. I'm teaching from and building on people who've been doing this work for such a long time. So
Okay.
what I really love, I use the elements of journalism, which is now probably in its 4th edition, and that's the Kovach and Rosensteel book. And one of their points is that the main thing that probably distinguishes journalism from other forms of media is the discipline of verification. So we all know this, we might know this as fact checking. That's one of the ways in which we do that. But it could also be checking on someone's definition of terms, for example. So a perfect example is journalism, right? Or journalist. Let's say journalist. A lot of people use journalist and they're describing different things. So one
Oh,
of the
yeah.
things
Yeah, no, it's really, really wide.
it's wide. So one of the things that I would do as a responsible, say I'm a student journalist, is to make sure that the person I'm talking to will define, oh, well, what do you mean by journalist? Can you tell me exactly? And I'll make sure I communicate that in whatever I'm producing. So I always tell them kind of the fundamental kind of flat line. I don't care if you're doing a podcast. I don't care if you're writing. I don't care if you're online. I don't care if you're on TikTok. I don't care. The fundamental baseline is verification, the practice of verification. And obviously, that brings in fact checking, that brings in research, that brings in evidence. That is the fundamental baseline. And then I think for me, going forward from that, I would then say transparency. So, transparency with your audience, of course, of how
Mm-hmm.
you got the information, of how you got the news, and then also transparency with your sources about how you're going to use that information, right? So those 2 things, verification, transparency, and then the last for me that I would say my top 3 would be providing context. I think that journalists are not just stenographers. Yeah. If we were, stenographers would just do it. But journalists are there to turn information into knowledge. And knowledge means providing context, having some understanding of history, having an understanding of how things came to be how they are, and being able to provide that context in your story and in your storytelling. Um, so I'll stop there, but there are a range of other ethics to kind of build on from that.
Well, just building off of that one, just based on my own experience, having worked in broadcast and specifically radio, a lot of the news that we do in those spaces, they're short hits, really. Like there just isn't, if you have 45 seconds to tell a story, and that's not unusual, there's no time for that. You just, the facts, and then that's it. And I just wonder a lot of times if broadcast, I mean, there's print journalism where I feel like there's a lot more leeway to do that, but with broadcasting there isn't necessarily, and a lot of people do get their news through broadcast, and so a lot of context and nuance can get lost in the sauce because the clock is merciless and we got to fit so many stories within a segment.
Absolutely. So the other thing I also try to teach in my class is that I started yesterday's class by saying I always start with a number of news pages up on the monitor. There's a big on-screen monitor in my class. There's about 14 students in the class, and they're all looking at the monitor, and I'm operating the laptop. And I usually have about 5 or 6 tabs of different news sites open, and it could range. And again, this is subjective. This is what I do. Right? Another journalist might look at something else, but generally, we get up in the morning and we're all checking these 6 different spaces or tabs or 20, whatever that number is. But we're looking at not just one source, not just one medium. We're looking at across all of them because I think we all are aware of the limitations of each format, right? So there's a particular kind of, so broadcast, you are time bound. And you're also bound, if you're television, you're bound by action. You need movement. You need to show people, show things happening, show things in action. So your storytelling is going to be bound within that. Okay, you watch it there. And then you might say this, take the same subject and go see, well, what is the Times or the Washington Post doing? That's a different format. They have a lot more room to get into context because they're using text. So you're looking at the same story. Let's say it's one of the endless Trump Kamala Harris stories, but it's the same story. But you're looking at that across mediums, and you're looking at that across different outlets and across different platforms. And that way, you're going to get, I think, an approximation to, oh, this is what's fully going on. But you wouldn't just look at one thing and get what's fully going on. You wouldn't just listen to that 45-second clip in the morning and be like, oh, I know what's happening. That's a start, but it's not the end.
I was going to say wouldn't or shouldn't.
That's a very good distinction. You shouldn't.
Okay.
You shouldn't.
Just want to be clear.
Listen, I think, look, if you're in 2024 and you're getting your news from one source, dude, that's not how this works. I mean, if you're trying to be informed, actually, that's not in a world. We are post democratization of media. We are post Walter Cronkite with the microphone. We're post that guy. We are literally, everybody has a microphone. I'm not telling you to listen to every single microphone. You can't possibly do that. The human brain would literally shut down. Mine certainly does. I'm not, okay? And I am an avid news consumer. But you pick your 4, your 5, or 6 that you trust, and you hit those in the morning or throughout the day. But it has to be multiples. It can't be just one, you know?
Carla, you also brought up the issue of fact checking. And I think it's interesting because it feels like right now we live in a time where, before I used to think facts were just that. They were a constant. It was the same thing. But today it seems like facts can, depending on who you're listening to, can be different for different journalists can say, well, this is my fact. These are the facts that I found. And so how do you teach journalists, future journalists, and also I think for the public to learn how we should be looking at what are facts and not opinion and not putting in your perspective in terms of what facts should be there. They are what they are. It shouldn't just change journalist to journalist or person to person.
Alternative facts, which I will never get over that phrase.
I choose not to say that. Yes.
I choose not.
Yeah. This is really, honestly, as a teacher, now that I'm teaching journalism, and I started teaching journalism maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, it is really interesting to transition from doing the work to now needing to explain to someone, oh, this is what this is. This is very different. And that comes up a lot, Dom. And I'll just tell you how I do it simply. And again, this is for Gen Z students who really don't consume any journalism at all. Yeah. This is not for people who read the New York Times every day. I usually do it through a photograph. So I break it down. I say, look, there are 2 ways to understand facts. There is the sky is blue. You can look out the sky and look out at the sky and see whether it's blue or gray or what have you. You can check that. That's a easily verifiable fact. But there are some fact details that are not so easily and objectively and empirically verifiable in that way. So I use a picture, excuse me, I use a picture from the Civil Rights Movement. It's a picture actually of one of the very famous ones of the Little Rock Nine. And it's particularly of, and I'm losing her name, of the little girl who's walking into the school, who's surrounded by the mob of white parents who are screaming. And the National Guard is there, of course. And there is another seeming white woman who's very close to her, behind her, and screaming at this young Black girl as she's walking into school and clutching her books in front of her. And I show that photograph from different vantage points because there were a couple of reporters on site that day. So I looked for different vantage points of that photograph. And I asked the students, we're all looking at the same photograph. What do you see? And you get different things. Yeah. And I asked them to identify who is in the photograph. And I think what's always fascinating to me is that when you're looking at the photograph, you think that the person, the white woman yelling at the girl, at the black girl, you think that's a woman. But then I actually tell them she's actually the same age as the girl. So it's not a woman. You thought you were looking at a woman, but that's a girl too. And we get into that like, well, we're both factually, we're looking at the same picture, but how is it that we're taking away different things? And I say to them, this is where verification comes in, where you're actually having to ask yourself, am I seeing the thing? Excuse me. Am I seeing the thing that I think I'm seeing? And that takes practice and training. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying that comes to people automatically, but that takes practice and training. So then I ask them, as a reporter, what would you do in this situation to figure out what's going on? Instead of assuming that this person, this woman is yelling at her, how would you get to this information? And I try to draw them into more, into less opinionated questioning. I try to get them to push themselves into a more, I don't want to use the word neutral space, but a less emotional space when looking at the picture and reacting to it, and just getting what are the facts? What are the empirical things you can see? What color is the dress? How is the hair styled? What are her hands doing? I mean, it sounds very basic, but I do think it does something. It kind of grounds you into, oh, you're kind of building a story brick by brick, and it gets you to the actual story. I hope that explained it, like how I
Mm-hmm.
try to, but they are different. You can't tell the students, there are different kinds. There are kind of two roads of facts. There's empirically observable facts, and then there are the facts that are shaped by our perspectives and by our standpoints and where we're coming from. And that's why I use the picture to do. Now, last thing, I think that the environment in which we're having this discussion about facts is so corrupted. Um, it is just so difficult and impossible to have this conversation, I think, in a bigger venue or in an open venue. I think it works more so in smaller spaces. Think it works more so in trust networks, because the things that I'm explaining are common sense. But I do think that what I am saying, if we're in such a corrupted environment around, with misinformation and disinformation and people who are intentionally trying to poison um, meaning, who are intentionally trying to poison the dictionary definition of words. So I am also aware of the forums in which I'm even having this conversation about meaning and facts. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think that's so interesting because you know I've been I look a lot on social media in terms of how they report, and sometimes it's even like, listen, there'll be influencers, you'll hear stories, and they'll talk about other people, and what ends up happening sometimes is it seems like rage baiting, things like that are meant to get a reaction, and we've talked about this before with other people too, about how if something elicits that type of reaction, you should be suspicious. But I think we as human beings are so used to, it's tough sometimes because you get caught up in the dialogue and you seeing what's going on in the conversation, and you get caught up in. I really do believe there are people who put misinformation out there to confuse what the facts are. So therefore, now people question everything, and who does that benefit in the end? It benefits the people who have something to gain the most. And if you mix up the facts where it's not understand, where you don't even know what is a fact anymore, you start questioning, well, wait a minute, is that the truth or is that not? And I guess, even when you brought up trust networks, like what is a trust network, and what is it that we can do, even because we are talking about teaching younger people, Gen Z, because I think that's so important that they also have this base learning of, we all can get caught up in the rage baiting, but how can we do that? How do we teach people to really not get, emotionally invested first, like in the sense of just being angry or being upset and saying, well, wait a minute, that's just wrong. And how do we do that? It sounds easy, but it seems really hard at the same point.
I think that's such a great question. I also think it's impossible, Dom. We're humans. We respond to emotion. That's just what we do. And I think that attempts to intervene to cut that short or to stymie that are going to fail because we're
Hmm.
going against our human nature, right?
Hmm.
I think that I was in a room recently where actually I think it might have been one of the guys who wrote that book, made the point that journalists, we're very good at our job, we're very good at the craft, but we actually don't know a lot about um, the science of how human beings interact with communication or there and I'm not an expert. I'm not a journal. I am a journalist. That's what I'm an expert in, but it is true. There are fields of people who study communication and how human beings actually generally respond to those things. I think we would be better off actually as a field if we had a better understanding at how our craft in this technological environment, post internet, of course, how our craft triggered people. Like, I am not sure that we're very clear on what those trigger points are within our work. Um, I think also this question of emotion, it's also funny. And I know I'm jumping around because this is not, I don't have an answer to this because it's an excellent question because it really is a live debate. I had a student yesterday who said, I don't want to be a journalist. Um,
And I said, I don't blame you. And we ended the class.
um, but she had a very lucid explanation for why. She said, and she drew on emotion. She said that journalism is only about one emotion, which is pain. It is always showing what's bad in the world. So it is only triggering to her one very particular emotion all the time, over and over and over and over. Now, she said that she's in the class because she wants to learn the techniques, she wants to learn verification, she wants to learn all of that. But in the work that she does, she wants to prime the range of human emotions, including the range of good ones too.
Well, I mean, in all fairness, we did talk to an organization. Oh God, my brain is completely no, but solutions journalism. There we
Oh
go.
yeah.
And that was one of the things that they really focused on, that they were finding people responded positively to. But before we move on to another point of ethics, I do just also want to bring up that emotions in journalism, like, okay, I can obviously only speak to my own personal experience, but as a Black woman following some of the stories that we've had to follow in the last few years, there's and the way that those stories have been covered, either particularly about police shootings of Black people, there's no way there's just I'm not going to read those headlines and there's not going to be an emotional reaction. There's a deep seated emotion within me for that, and then it becomes like, well, again, as you were talking about, Carla, with the context, um, you know, the nuance that might have gotten cut out of the story or didn't really fit because there was only so many words and there's only so much time, but that's where the emotion point is for me.
Yeah, and it is for all of I mean, certainly I am 110% with you. And I think if I'm the reporter covering those stories though, and I know that about myself, I think where my training kicks in though, I think that's why I say this is a practice. I don't think this is human. When I say human, that sounds so harsh. I mean, I don't mean that this is something that comes naturally. And let me talk about myself. To me, I think that it has to be training. This is why journalism training and also having an editor is so important because
Mhm.
your emotion, you're in the space, you're covering your story. You need to be, I do think that you have to be in it to cover it well, to get all the details, to see the things. But I do think that the training of pulling back and asking yourself a form of, am I seeing what I think I am seeing? Am I hearing what I think I am hearing? I think that is a healthy practice for journalists in order to get to actually the truth and not let emotion override. And I think it's also healthy for, quite frankly, for the consumers as well to kind of
That's so
there has to be a
true.
breath and a pause because the emotion is always going to be there. You can't cut that out and you shouldn't. Yeah, that makes us lovely and who we are and interesting. But I do think that there has to be that pause. And I think that editors were typically, that was definitely a pause. We're seeing, obviously, because the industry has shrunk so much, we have fewer and fewer editors, we have
Yeah.
fewer and fewer people doing this practice, just pause. But that's really what you need, is that training for that pause part to kick in. And then you ask, what am I really seeing, hearing, feeling, touching? And list those, and literally list those things. List them, and it will get you closer to the truth.
I'm okay. Now I'm also, I've got so many questions. Obviously, I've got questions. It's what I do. But I now, because I'm hearing what you're saying, but I'm also sensing perhaps a point of tension. Because, for example, if you're in a breaking news situation, and that's when, at least in broadcasting, you get a lot of viewers because this is breaking news. And again, that pause, that moment, there isn't necessarily time for that when you've got to feed the beast. We've got a deadline. It's 5 minutes. I just need to know what's going on, what happened, who, etc. Like, oh my God. And then, but I'm also thinking about, audience reactions. And because that breaking news situation is so high adrenaline for everyone involved, including the audience, when that's over and you get a chance to have that break in that moment to give the story nuance, some people have already tuned away. They've moved on and they're not getting that.
Yeah, or they might not be getting it from you. They might be getting it
Oh.
somewhere else.
Oh my God.
Apologies.
Hanging on my every word. Okay, anyway.
I do think so. Yes. So breaking news. I'm always like, breaking news makes me laugh because I think everything these days is breaking news. Like I put on a new shirt today. Breaking news. Anyway. Um, but yes. So in breaking news context, I think this is where the change that has certainly happened with the democratization of media is that. And when I say that, I mean with the internet coming online and social networks and social media. The change that has to happen is that the consumer now has to be educated about how media actually works and how news actually works. And this is where the ethic of transparency comes in. So, as a breaking news reporter or the station, responsibly, you would say, this is a breaking news report. And dear listener, of course, that means that the story is developing. That means that some of the details that we're initially reporting may change over time. Please stay with us over the next 24 to 48-hour period as this story develops. And towards the end, you're educating your consumer that, and they understand that. You're literally in the middle of the thing when it's happening or in proximity to it. Information is just coming out. So that means that the follow stories are going to be more nuanced from the same source. So from you. So that means your day 2 story, your day 3 story is going to be the full, absolute, accurate thing. And you will correct yourself audibly and powerfully in that day 3 stories. Any mistakes you might have made in that day 1 story, the breaking one, you will correct them for the listener to hear. So I do think that's how you handle that in terms of applying ethics. And I think applying transparency to your listener, reader, watcher, whoever that is.
Okay. Also, one other thing, objectivity. How, again, Dom and I have had a lot of conversations about, where is the space as a journalist to bring your authentic selves to a story? Because again, we all have unique experiences, unique perspectives, etc. And yet to maintain that objectivity, which sometimes can seem abusive, like for the story where, the journalist is just standing there watching. They're not doing anything. They're not, and I don't know. That's something that seems like sometimes I myself struggle with, even though I've never stepped into a story because again, I'm just there to cover it. But where is, I guess, that line and how does that work as an ethic?
Well, first, may I ask you, when you say your authentic self, what do you mean? Bring your authentic self to the story.
My full self as a Black cisgendered woman. I guess now middle age, but the book. No, but the
Me
point is
too.
that but those experiences do shape the way that I've experienced the world. I find that at least when I do interviews, they definitely shape the kind of questions that come to mind and the things that I will ask. But when I'm doing something that's more reporting based, that doesn't always feel like it might shape something in terms of like who I might go to if I'm looking for man on the street or something like that, to make sure I've got as broad of a sense of, like people's opinions or thoughts of something. But for a story, yeah, I'm not always sure if that's like the correct place for me to be bringing that part of myself to it, because again, I'm there to get the facts of what has taken place.
Yeah. So again, facts. um, okay. So I don't believe in objectivity as an ethic. So let me just put that out on the table there. It doesn't, I think it's something it's made up over time. And not, I think there's plenty of research and plenty of evidence to show that this is true, right? In the development of journalism over the 20th century, you can see when this idea of objectivity came in, what its original intentional definition was, as opposed to what it became over time. And not even the 20th century, that starts in the 19th century. So I am not going to go into that. There are tons of authors who have done that work. I do not believe in objectivity. I am a human being. I like, again, let's start at the facts, yeah, and work from there. And the facts are, I am a human being. I am not a robot. And even if I were a robot, I would have been a robot programmed by a human being. So whatever it is their frame is, that's in the robot too. Okay.
Oh, good
Right.
point.
So I think number one, let's start there, and I'll speak for myself. And this is why I make a distinction between objectivity, which I think is a myth. I also worked with Lewis Raven Wallace. I don't know if you guys know that, who wrote an entire book called the Myth of Objectivity. I advise people to go check that out as well. But I make a distinction between objectivity and objectivity of method. Yeah. So I'm still bringing and I had these. When I was reporting full time, I had these tensions all the time, but it was never within myself. It was always with my editor or my outlet, because my editor would typically be white.
Yes,
And
well, I've
coming and
had an experience where like next time don't say that, and so now
right,
in my head it's spinning around. We're like, okay, don't say anything.
right, and that's not objectivity. That is a battle of perspective and power. So, and let me add a bit more. It's not just that the editor is white. It is, and let's be clear here, because I think that journalists like to, and we don't get this in our training, we don't get this in our journalism school education. Let's be very clear that this country was set up to have different experiences for people based on race, because of segregation, because of Jim Crow. So a white American generally will have a very different experience of citizenship as compared to a Black American. You cannot ignore that. So of course, these two people coming from, one is coming, let's say, the suburbs of Long Island, which were literally carved out for them, is going to look at their perspective on an event, on how it's happening, what's taking shape, why it's happening. Of course, is going to be different. And as an editor, if I were running my own outlet, I want that in my reporters. I want both of those perspectives on the same event. I want to platform both of those things for my audience, because my goal is to fully inform my audience. My goal is not to inform my audience with only one perspective or one experience of citizenship in this country. My goal is to inform an audience with all the multiple experiences of citizenship in this country, unequal experiences of citizenship in this country. And then my audience can make an informed decision. Does that make sense? And then, like, I want to
it
get
absolutely does.
And I want to get to the part about objectivity of method. So you mentioned man on the street. So, and I say this to my class, and this is really good training. And I remember this is in the first, actually in J school, which I always love man on the streets, because I am the person who talks to everybody anyway. I am the one who's like, hey, so I say to them when they're going out and I'm saying, hey, go out, do this man on the street. When they come back, who did you talk to? List who you talk to. Oh, these look like all women names. Why did you only speak to women? If I'm speaking to a girl, a young woman, why did you only speak to women, or a male? Why did you only speak to men? Right? And this can work if you're not cisgender, if you're also trans. It can work either way. Are you only choosing people who you think are like you? Again, this is the training of it. It's checking yourself. And we're all going to gravitate initially, not all of us, many of us gravitate initially to the sources or the people who look like us, who sound like us, where we don't have to do a lot of explanation. But as a reporter, I think the training kicks in and asks you to say, oh no, this is me subjectively operating in this story. If I were to apply objectivity as method to this story, maybe I might, and the story is about, let's say the story is, I'm trying to think of something that just happened. Oh gosh, I don't want to think. There was a horrible story of a rape in France, and I don't want to bring that in, but it's so horrible. It was in my mind, but let's say that's what it is. And I'm getting opinion from man in the street. Am I only going to go talk to 10 men? Am I only going to go talk to 10 women? Or do I talk to 5 women, 5 men? Right? That is a more objective approach to that story. Or this happened to a woman who it seemed who was older in years. Do I talk to young women only who are 19, or do I talk to women who are middle aged and up, who are in their 50s and 60s, who are closer in age to the woman who this happened to? Those are the kinds of questions I think that show objectivity of method. Right? You're trying to approximate whatever that story is, you're trying to approximate either who the story is about, getting as close as possible to those situations, or you're trying to show a range of opinion or a range of perspectives on that thing. But it's always about, I think that the main thing here is the self checking, right? Which is, again, verification. You're
Mm-hmm.
not just verifying like other people, you're also verifying within yourself. And I think that's the training, and that's the practice, the ethical practice, actually. But it requires practice. That's the important part. It
And does it
requires
all?
practice.
And Carl, does it also require like what everything you've also mentioned too in terms of like editors? I think what Jenna and I do, we bring different parts of ourselves when we're doing interviews, when we're talking about questions we want to ask, because each of us sometimes think of things a little differently sometimes. And you bring some, and I mean, I think it's natural in everything in life. You know what I mean? You get a group of people together and you could think of a question that you would never have asked because maybe it came to you. And sometimes you all do after a certain amount of time, you do start to see things, your mind works differently. So I think the importance of community seems like having, I guess my thing is this, like when you have a lot of new people who are starting out and going on things like social media and they're alone and they're doing these things by themselves. What could people who are doing this who maybe say like, you know what, I don't want to go work for legacy media. I want to do it on my own. What is there something that could be done where people can check themselves and not if and again outside of just being alone having somebody that they can ask questions of or maybe there's some of the resources that they could be doing to challenge themselves or maybe what are ways to kind of just like you said check oneself and sort of like wait because sometimes there's a lot of that unknown bias that we bring into these situations where you're not even realizing you're seeing things a certain way you're not asking those other questions you might think you think you're doing a great job but maybe it's like oh, I didn't notice I was asking only people of a certain age. I was only asking men those questions. I was not being diverse in the people I was asking those questions. What can be done for people, again, who are maybe more, they're independent journalists on their own and how they can sort of do that, checking
Yeah.
themselves?
Yeah. So even look, there's such a thing as this audits within newsrooms, right? To
Right.
check whether your sources are diverse. And the reason they do that, literally you collect it on an Excel sheet. Literally you do that because as you're doing your work, you don't realize your biases, these implicit biases that we have. We don't realize that we have them, right? So you actually have to document them scientifically in a scientific way and check them. And that happens in community. That happens with other people. It doesn't happen alone. Um, I think for the person who is doing that, I guess two things. One, I hope they're working in community. And I hope because I don't see that, I don't see these kinds of this kind of self checking. Um, and I don't see that happening only if you work alone and with yourself. I think this stuff happens, this practice happens in community, in conversation, um, with your colleagues. It's collegial. And it happens not just with your editor, it happens with your peer group. I have a peer group of other reporters or other editors, and we're talking about this stuff constantly. And all of that is a form of self checking. All of that is a form of verification and the practice. Um, there was one other point I was going to make about the checking alone, and it just went out of my head. Um, but yeah, let's leave it there. But I don't think, I hope that they get into community with other people where those things can happen. But I don't think it'll happen by yourself. Here we are, my second point. The other way, the other way. Listen, I'm middle age. It's happening. It's happening.
Oh, listen,
Stop.
painfully so.
So the other thing, and let me just speak for myself, and differences I've noticed. Look, there are different reasons. Let's talk about journalists. There are different reasons that people become journalists. Yeah. Some people become journalists because they want to be famous. Some people become journalists because they just want to see their byline. It's not necessarily because they're interested in public service. I became a journalist because I wanted to serve my community. I genuinely believe in civics and public service. That is my mission. It has been since I started in 2005 officially, and it still is my mission today. And that mission helps to orient me, and that is my compass. Right? So when the emotions are rearing and I need that practice to kind of kick in, that mission is what sets me and grounds me. Now, if your mission, and I think this will go for influencers as well and other people who work alone, a lot of, if some of them are honest with themselves, their reason for doing the work they do, and some of them are entertaining and wonderful and excellent, but their reasons for doing the work they do might not be public service. It might be entertainment. It might be to make people laugh. And then in those situations, do you need to or want to do the self checking and the self practice? I'm not so sure. Now, if you are an influencer who cares very deeply about public service, I'll put it in language I think that in the spaces that I'm in a lot where that people are more familiar with. If you're an influencer and you care very deeply about Black community or Latino community or Asian American community or South Asian community, right? But a geographic space of people, you can see them, you've been there, you know what it is, whether that's Harlem or part of Ohio, it doesn't matter. If you're an influencer and you care about this community of people and you care that they are informed above all, yeah, that I think that kind of orientation will help you to search for the self-checking. It will help you to search for the community of people, of practitioners, of other influencers who will also check you. Because the prime thing that you care about is that this group of people, this community of people that you care about, you care that they are informed and they make good decisions. And does that make sense? And that will help to guide your ethical practice. But a lot of people are doing this work, are doing work, and whether they're journalists or whether they're influencers, and public service is not their North Star. So that's the first question, I think, to get to that.
Well, for the ethics that we've covered so far, because our conversation has kind of meandered a little bit, but I got sources, I got facts. We covered that objectivity is not a thing. That's a made up well, everything is made up, but you know what I mean, a made up concept. So what are the other things though that you try to hammer home, at least in general, to your students?
Beyond the three. So I mentioned verification. We talked about objectivity of method, transparency, context. Other ethics might be, I hammer home those. I'll be frank. Those are the ones that I really hammer home.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Those are the ones that I really hammer home. And then there are others. I mean, for example, diversity might be an ethic, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
not everybody's clearing that bar.
Equity might be an ethic.
Yeah, a lot of people aren't clearing that bar.
Do no harm may be an ethic. And that is supposed to be an older journalism ethic, but I do think that goes out the window quite a lot but do no harm might also be an ethic. So there's a difference between if you're interviewing, let's say, obviously we have massive homeless crises all around the country, unhoused crises all around the country. There's a massive difference between when you're doing these men on the streets and you're interviewing a guy in like a $5,000 suit versus the homeless guy who's sitting out there like with his cup. Yeah. So there are different ways to approach these two human beings, right? They're both human beings, but there are different ways you're going to handle their information. You're going to communicate your handling of their information, um, using their name, all of those things. So those are a couple of the ethics that have also come up. So let's see, that's equity, diversity, do no harm. I'm trying to think of some of the other. I used to have Outlier Media in Detroit had this really great list of ethics that they use that I actually printed up because I loved it so much, but it's at school. It's in my classroom at school. And I'm talking to you from home, so I don't have it with me to show you. But again, each newsroom will create their own standard of ethics, right? Depending on the population they serve.
Mhm.
So MLK 50 in Memphis, Tennessee, a lot of their news is very much for working class Black Memphis, and a lot of their ethic kind of comes out of that, which I think is so exciting. I actually wish we had more, just a wider range of outlets. I just wish we had more, and I hope that we're able to reverse this decline soon.
Same here.
Very
Same here.
true. And so, Carl, the last question we ask all our guests is, how did you become involved? How did you become a journalist? What led you to the path of journalism?
Yeah. Life is a weird thing, isn't it? Because I also now I'm a media organizer, and I never thought I'd become an organizer. Um, so it really comes out of, and I told my students this yesterday because I like to tell them. You tell them obviously the professional bio, but the part that really means the most to me is the personal part. And there are two seminal experiences in my life. One, I'm an immigrant. People never know that because I code switch. So I psych people out all the time, not on purpose. But I came to this country when I was 9 years old with my mom, single mom. And then about 2 years, 2.5 years after that, I started attending a very famous school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan called the Dalton School. Um, and that experience, so those two experiences basically changed the entire trajectory of my life, and especially going to Dalton. So I started there when I was 12, and I would take the train, if you can imagine, from Queens to Manhattan, like Queens near Long Island, not like not Western Queens, Eastern Queens. I took the train an hour and a half to get to the Upper East Side every morning and every evening to get home. And I did that by myself. My mom comes and she's like, "Hey, baby girl, this is how you do it. There you go. Go do you." Right? This was 1989. I think now we've had a discussion where she's like, "Oh my God, I did that to you in 1989." Because that's a lot. That's a lot in 1989. But I told the students there's a pain and a privilege of that experience. The painfulness of the experience of being the different person, right? Because I was part of an experiment. I was part of an integration experiment, a diversity experiment. In the early 80s, a lot of this stuff, diversity, all of that stuff was really kind of starting to take off. And my group, I was one of the first kind of large cohorts of students of color to integrate private schools in the Northeast, right? So I was an experiment, and that's a painful experience. But the privilege of it is that I got to compare in real time these two very different worlds, and actually multiple worlds, on that hour and a half long trip home and to school. I passed through so much from the beginning to the end. You get to see how people are treated because of their zip code, and then who gets to live in the zip code because of their color. And you compare that to where you're coming from in your origin zip code, and who lives in your zip code, and how they sound and their accents. And I think that experience, certainly for me, was really foundational, the comparison. And I think I made a decision And at the same time, mass incarceration was happening at the same time. So my friends were being pulled into jail and all these kinds of things. So I'm really seeing in real time. And I said to myself, I always liked writing, all those things as we all do. We grow up kind of storytelling. And I said to myself, wow, you have kind of an inside lens view of just this difference, these different worlds, and maybe you could be a bridge. That's how I kind of like saw myself. Maybe you could be a bridge between these two different experiences that you're seeing. Maybe you could explain things in a better way than has happened before. I said that to myself, and I think I kind of put myself in this. And I came to journalism very, very late because look, I'm an immigrant, single mama, immigrant. She is not pushing journalism as a career. So I came to journalism very, very late, but I really came after kind of sorting through those kinds of those drives, those impulses, what I wanted to do. And I do think that hopefully I've done that. Hopefully I've been a kind of bridge to better explain or better show or better tell.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, Carla, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us, to give us your take. No, seriously, on the ethics
Yes.
of journalism. I mean, it's a subject that I'm sure we will revisit again and again, but I think this was a great conversation, and I definitely learned a lot.
Same.
I absolutely learned so much too from the questions. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed this very much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Carla. Thank you.
Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett. Research by Lori Ruthenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.